For over 35 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we want to review the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we want to start with images from near the Russian city of Saratov, about 600 kilometers east of Ukraine. This morning, in yet another attack, the Ukrainian army launched operations there using kamikaze drones. Another refinery in Russia was targeted and hit in the attack, which annually processes a significant amount of 7 million liters of oil, producing essential fuel and various other chemical substances from it. And now we see and we hear how the employees there, actually employees of the Ministry of Emergency Situations, but they were apparently also armed, like they're talking about it, how they hear it in the background. And we also see these spotlights. These are images that evoke memories of the Second World War. They're attempting to shoot down this drone. However, now we also see the last shots being fired here, though the gentlemen appear to be somewhat desperate. Because at this moment, you can see here, right at the end, exactly the location where the drones had flown to. Right there, where the spotlight is located, the defense spotlight, where the guns are mounted, the anti-aircraft weaponry, anti-aircraft guns, and where you can clearly see where the refinery is located. That's precisely where the explosion happens, showing that Ukraine has once again managed to attack a Russian refinery. These continuous and relentless assaults, occurring nearly every day for several months now, are increasingly causing significant damage and harm to Russia. We know that there has been a halt in various refineries, so they can no longer operate. Russia has been actively implementing various measures to restrict the exportation of gasoline and diverse types of fuels over the past months because they is facing dwindling capacities and thus needs those resources for itself. And what we observed was the usage of drones, especially kamikaze drones. Over the past few months, Ukraine has successfully developed a completely new and pioneering technology, commonly referred to as rocket drones. So these are drones as you might have previously known them, but they now operate without propellers, using a turbine engine for propulsion instead. And this turbine is mounted here, we can see it fairly well, on the outside of the drones. We can see it on the back here, that this specimen we're looking at here, called Peklo, has a range of 700 kilometers, so it could, as we just saw, fly to Saratov. However, and this is the special feature, due to these engines that are installed here, and due to the aerodynamic design of these rocket drones, they won't fly at 150, but travel at a speed of 700 kilometers per hour instead. That means they are approximately 4 times as fast as the drones previously used, thus presenting a significantly greater challenge for the Russian air defense systems. So we see that Ukraine is developing these drones here underground. We've edited out the fact that President Zelensky has visited this particular factory where there's an intention to produce drones and rocket drones, or you could almost describe them as cruise missiles, that are capable of flying up to 2,500 kilometers, enabling us to potentially reach nearly all Russian refineries. And they're being manufactured in large quantities, just as we can observe here. This indicates that we are witnessing an ever-expanding and increasingly capable Ukrainian industry. The arms industry is producing more and more of it, and yes, as we see here, there's a dream of one day bombing the Kremlin with it. Nevertheless, as we are fully aware, there's a halt and stoppage coming from the Western nations. Moscow as a city itself must not be attacked, and the political centers of Putin's regime must not be targeted at all. However, as we've seen in recent days, weeks, months, refineries and critical infrastructures across the country, we see that was just the beginning. Ukraine is now manufacturing cruise missiles, attempting to beat the current Russian superiority of the R-55, R-101, or caliber cruise missiles, the different ones we've seen there in this Russian superiority. Yeah, and eventually to catch up and be in a position where they can manufacture more, producing a larger quantity of cruise missiles than Russia is capable of at this moment in time. We stay in Russia, traveling from Saratov to Kursk, and take a detailed look at the situation present there. Namely, we have several new attacks by the North Korean troops being deployed here. We can observe it here in this initial footage provided. It shows how the North Korean troops are moving strategically along a forest ridge, steadily advancing in the direction of the Ukrainian lines. However, this attack by the North Koreans is also completely crushed by the Ukrainian army. We're observing here that a wide variety of weapons are being utilized, not only kamikaze drones but consistently regular artillery ammunition, as well as widespread use of cluster munitions. Here we are observing cluster munitions, which impact in these circular patterns scattered throughout the area, continuing to significantly decimate and reduce the numbers of the North Korean troops stationed here. For several days or even weeks, it was said that the North Koreans were no longer in action because they had suffered such heavy losses. It seems that there is currently a new wave, a renewed effort from the Kremlin to try and break through the front lines here. This is being done by bringing in large numbers of North Korean soldiers, deploying them en masse in an attempt to achieve their goals. However, and quite intriguingly, this nicely transitions us to the primary topic of today's broadcast, the The dynamic we're now observing is no longer like in the recent weeks, where Russia kept advancing and Ukraine was losing more areas in Kursk and within its own territory. However, over the past few days, we've observed a very cautious but notable trend where Ukraine appears to be regaining the initiative. This occurs amid increased movement from North Koreans approaching the frontier, illustrating that Ukraine is prepared and ready in many cases to act decisively and effectively as the situation unfolds. While we can see one of the North Korean soldiers here, relatively large, although pixelated, who was injured here. And here, who is now afraid of further drone attacks, that Ukraine is slowly regaining the initiative, or at least that the Russian advances have almost completely come to a halt, including in Kursk. In Kursk, we are facing the situation, as can be observed on the map, that Ukraine is currently progressing on the advance. She has initiated a counteroffensive in this region, specifically in the southeastern part of the front in Kursk. As we can observe here, they have succeeded in capturing 2 and potentially even 3 smaller villages located southeast of Tsutsha, and are now gradually advancing towards Ulanok. Ulanok continues to be occupied by the Russians. This area was held by the Ukrainian army during the months of August and September of last year. Plekovo was also held by the Ukrainian army, and we remember the Russians advanced very far there. This area was roughly recaptured here, nevertheless by now. The Russians aren't advancing any further. The Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive just before Tsutsha, about 2 kilometers away, when the Russians were there. Currently, as we clearly observe up there, they've successfully pushed the Russians back by roughly 5 kilometers from Tsutsha. We have a similar situation in the north of the front. Here at Malaya Loknya, the Russians have gotten very close to this locality, also to the tracks that run there along with the road that goes through there, and the Ukrainian army has recaptured these areas. That means anyone who thought since October, well, the Russians have been reclaiming about 20% of the territory every month, this will be over by January or February, then 100% would be under Russian control is wrong. No, the Russian army simply lacks the necessary capability to recapture the key locations here, but at this moment in time, following Donald Trump's presidency in the United States, it is Ukraine that is further extending its territorial control in the Kursk region. And not only in the Russian Kursk, but also around the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, it is Ukraine that has launched various counterattacks, now trying here to push back the Russians and is seeing some significant success. Let's take a closer look at the footage from the small town of Kotlin. Kotlin, a very, very small place, which is strategically important to them because it is situated almost at the end of the flanking by Pokrovsk on one side. We'll look at it on the map in a moment, and also on the strategically important road to the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast of the neighboring region, through which Pokrovsk is supplied. Now we see here how Russians are advancing in Kotlin, how they have occupied this place with relatively large numbers of personnel also used here. However, we're shortly going to see a Ukrainian counterattack on this location, specifically on Kotlin. We can now see how the attack begins. Again, we can pinpoint it very well. In this specific scenario, the Ukrainians are launching their attack from the northeast, and Kotlina is now completely under the control of Russian forces. We'll soon see how the Ukrainian soldiers manage to push the Russians out, or rather, to kill. Most Russians are killed, and how Ukrainian soldiers in turn establish a foothold in Kotlin, how they go in there. The whole thing from the unit scale, which has received a lot of praise in recent days, even from other Ukrainian units, because they, quote, has achieved superhuman feats in order to reclaim these areas near Pokrovsk, particularly those to the south of Pokrovsk, and successfully bring them back under full Ukrainian control. We're watching the footage. It appears to be a CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle in use here. We also see the massive explosions around. Those are probably Russian Grad rockets hitting around the Ukrainian advance. And we then observe how infantry units are repeatedly deployed, and in this particular instance they are not just briefly deployed to eliminate the Russians and then vanish, but it is extremely important for the Ukrainian army to firmly establish a presence here, to regain control of these towns so that, on one hand, Pokrovsk with its former 65,000 residents cannot be directly attacked from close proximity, and especially so that the supply routes to Pokrovsk remain intact for Ukraine. This is vital for the city's survival. So we see Ukrainian soldiers going back into the trenches, also returning to the houses, and now an M113 is being deployed here to deliver more infantrymen, and we can observe that on the outskirts of the village, Ukrainian forces are steadily regaining their foothold, while the surviving Russian troops are retreating from the area. We'll also take a look at this on the map and can see here a really relatively new and quite impressive development in recent days. A color we haven't seen here for a long time, namely the color blue. Blue represents the recaptures by Ukraine in the Russian-occupied territory. On the one hand, there's an advancing Ukrainian push happening here at Donetsk. We've also got, at Peshana, a crucial Ukrainian advance was made, as only 2 small villages were left to Pokrovsk. And what we've just observed, it's not highlighted in blue yet, however, it is already marked in orange. What goes into this area, this orange zone located south or southeast of Kotlin, represents the third significant advance the Ukrainian army has executed in this region over the past few days. And where, as can be proven not only with located material but also corroborated through furious reports from Russian war bloggers, it can indeed be confirmed that right here, for the very first time in several months, and quite possibly even the first time in many years, has successfully reclaimed territory in this region. We know since 2023, since the Ukrainian counteroffensive, especially in the south of the country, but also near Bakhmut in Donetsk, in the Donetsk region failed, it has been mainly the Russians that have steadily advanced, continuing to make significant progress in the last few months, originating from Selidov, and have now attempted executing this flanking to continue the movements here, south of Pokrovsk, and crucially, to successfully reach that road up there. Their goal was to ensure that the large E50 can no longer be used by the Ukrainians, and thus Pokrovsk, as we mentioned, with formerly 65,000 inhabitants, as well as Mironorad with formerly 40,000 inhabitants, can no longer be supplied. And in this regard, it is absolutely crucial for Ukraine's survival, at least for these specific cities, to strike back firmly and put an end to this ongoing flanking situation. At the moment, you need to approach it with caution. What's happening is that the Ukrainians they're in the process of gradually reclaiming sections of the occupied territories. However, the question, of course, is how long it will last, whether this is a momentum that can be maintained over the next weeks and months, whether they can really defend Pokrovsk, or if the Russians with newly brought in men and tanks will turn things around again. What the Ukrainians are expressing and what they are also hoping for is the belief that so many Russian soldiers have been killed here over the past weeks and months. And that's the secret. The Ukrainians say it quite clearly. You have to kill every Russian to have a chance of gaining numerical superiority here, because the Ukrainians have notably fewer soldiers deployed at the front compared to the Russians. If that succeeds, then we can advance further here and prevent the Russians from capturing Pokrovsk. We're heading further south into the area of Andrivka. In that place too, we have Ukrainian counterattacks, in this case on Sribne. Here too we see that the Russians have captured, let's let this run briefly, that the Russians have captured Srebrenica. In my opinion, this is the school that is currently being used by the Russians as their headquarters. Here it's also quite easy to see right by the football field, directly in this case to the west of it. And we can clearly see Ukrainian tanks approaching from the west, making their entry into Sribne to energetically engage and attack the Russian forces stationed there. How can they do that? Utilizing their kamikaze drones, the Ukrainians have managed to effectively destroy nearly all Russian armored vehicles present within this particular region. This implies the Russians lack any tanks here for their defense. The Ukrainians also have an eye on the whole situation. This means they can monitor the next 10, 15, 20 kilometers into the Russian-held territory and are thus able to directly halt any reinforcements of armored vehicles there. What remains for the Ukrainians is the extreme danger from kamikaze drones. The Russians also have always kamikaze drones which they use to move into the various villages they have conquered. And we know they don't need to get very close anymore. They can stay 10 to 15 kilometers away and attack from there. However, the Ukrainians are now actively trying to make the most of their advantage in this situation, as the Russian forces on site are unable to defend themselves in the manner they would prefer to. But rather, they can simply drive in with a couple of tanks, which allows them to potentially create considerable destruction in the region. And this here, we must clearly say, is not a recapture, it's not a counterattack, but this is a so-called search and destroy mission. That means the Russians are being hunted. You know where they are located? In buildings beforehand, like the school, often the largest in the village, where they are barricaded, and these are then attacked from all sides, until the threat is at least neutralized from the perspective of the Ukrainian army. We also want to take a closer look at this on the map and see that the situation in the area around Andrivka continues to be remains hazardous for the Ukrainian army, particularly in various places. What we just saw were recordings from Srebrenica up here, and the Ukrainian tanks essentially drove in from the western side into Sribne, opened fire there, and then subsequently withdrew again. A strategy that the Ukrainian forces are currently employing in order to eliminate as many of the attacking forces as possible, thereby significantly hindering their ability to advance rapidly. However, here in Andrivka, we're also dealing with the situation in which the Russian army has successfully managed to occupy a large portion of the town. They've not only advanced into the heart of the center here, but have also reportedly been observed on the western outskirts already. And the entire situation here becomes extremely challenging and dangerous for the Ukrainians, as they are attempting to defend another pocket or stronghold in this area. This indicates that a section of Darkny still remains under Ukrainian control. As we are already aware, down here was Kurakov, which unfortunately they lost roughly about a month ago. They're trying to keep defending this whole area. And to some extent, So far, there's been success, partly because nature lends a hand. We have small rivers both to the north and south that the Russians are finding quite difficult to cross, but the Russians must basically definitely continue to advance here. From the east, and the Ukrainians are currently still holding up well against it. However, it is always a question of which units of the Ukrainian army we have on the ground. We've observed that in Pokrovsk, the newly established 155th Brigade along with the Skala unit, among numerous others, have been dispatched there to ensure the defense of Pokrovsk. Further south, we currently have extremely tired and very depleted military units that have already been forced to pull back from Kursk, indicating they are dealing with a very negative and challenging momentum behind them. And these military units are making attempts to defend themselves in some way, but meanwhile, at least in the Andriivka region, with relatively limited success. One must honestly admit, because the Russian forces, well, after seizing around 20 settlements surrounding Kursk in the past 3 months, they are now taking advantage of their gained momentum to further attempt to push forward. Nevertheless, it's not progressing nearly as quickly as we witnessed prior to the end of the year. There were a considerable number of heavily armored vehicles and thousands of soldiers that were effectively utilized. These tanks have been mostly destroyed, the soldiers have been mostly killed, and as a result, we now have a significantly slower movement of the Russian army towards the west. We'll remain in the Donetsk region for a little while longer, moving a bit further northwards towards the city of Donetsk. This city was captured by the Russian army, albeit at a very high price, and that cost continues to increase. We are seeing some footage released by Ukraine which seems to show the deployment of a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft gun or an Igla-type anti-aircraft missile. Now here, as we carefully observe it fully zoomed in, are being attacked by Russian ground attack aircraft of the Su-25 type. And these fighter jets make the mistake of releasing far too few decoys, far too few flares. And now we can observe here how the second one gets hit, crashes to the ground, and explodes dramatically. We'll soon see another perspective where we'll see again that yes, the Russians actually tried. Yes, in extreme low altitude flight, we see it here, flying just skimming above the ground. They then launch their unguided rockets in a westward direction at Ukrainian positions and subsequently attempt to fly back east again. However, as already mentioned, there are no decoys to be seen, and that will be the demise of at least one of the Su-25 ground attackers as it crashes and violently explodes. And that's naturally another, at least a small milestone victory, a little success for the Ukrainian army, which now stands west of Kursk and is trying to continue defending the city here. From the southeastern Ukrainian region of Donetsk, we proceed towards the northeastern Ukrainian region of Kharkiv, because there are also several bits of news, some new developments that we definitely want to take a closer look at. On one hand, there are still Russian tanks here trying to advance. We said that in Donetsk, there are fewer now because many were destroyed. In Kharkiv, the Russians appear to still have reserves that they are currently bringing to the front. And here we see one of these attacks, probably a T-72 or T-80 tank. We can also tell by the snow here, relatively recent footage, and again many infantrymen on top. That means not only should the tank move, but, and this is already a bit careless, on top of the tank where there is relatively little space, the infantrymen on there now are going up and down. But we can see how currently in the case of the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian army, numerous kamikaze drones are being directed towards these Russian vehicles that are then just shot together here. And in the end, we're in the situation again where we have to at least partly pixel it so that both the deployed tanks are destroyed, as well as the deployed soldiers ending up being killed. And of course, this presents a situation for the Russians that's not very sustainable because at the moment, and that's how it appears on certain parts of the front, lose so many soldiers and materials that they find themselves unable to adequately replenish them and not consistently able to deploy equivalent reserves to the respective areas on the front line. Certainly, it involves bringing war zones into action to advance further. This means we are watching footage from a location to the east of Kupiansk, another city that is situated along the Oskil River. We'll soon take a look at the map that the Russians are keen to capture. And we can clearly observe how in the first phase they begin to move tanks into these townships. These tanks are mostly destroyed, and the infantry that is deployed in these locations is then hunted by Ukrainian drones. And the entire situation, we witness it here once more at the end, is an absolute disaster for the Russians, who are attacking here and end up losing all the vehicles they had just deployed in the operation. Let's quickly take a look at the map, and we can see and assess that to the east of Kupiansk, there is currently a relatively favorable situation developing for Ukraine. They consistently succeed in destroying all the Russian attackers at this location. However, the images we just observed from this particular region do indicate that Ukraine is, in fact, relatively well represented here in a notable way. It's like once more, it always depends on the units that are involved and also, of course, on their equipment. Because up here we have an extremely difficult situation. This time we've drawn the Oskil River a bit better. This river, where the aim is to stop the Russians at the latest, this is achieved here in Kupiansk, but north of Kupiansk, it's becoming increasingly difficult. we have here, in fact, the fact that we have marked 3 localities that have been wholly or partially captured by the Russians on the western bank of the Ostkil, which means the Russians have successfully been able to cross over the Ostkil at this particular point, and the Russians have already, partly, moved 6 or 7 kilometers westward across the Baltic Sea. It's quite a tough situation for the Ukrainians, who once again have to face this significant threat. Yes, they are defending Kupiansk, they are even defending the bridgehead on the eastern bank of the river, but they simply cannot manage to hold the flanks. At the moment, it looks like the Russians might be attempting to flank to the north of Kupiansk. At least for now. Whether they succeed is another question. Still, they are advancing north of Kupiansk, having crossed the Ostkil. And that's incredibly challenging. We've marked another village up here on the map with the name Kolodyazne. The reason we decided to mark Kolodyazne is, in fact, quite straightforward and simple. That's the spot where our next video plays. We can already take a moment to recall. Here we also see it at the top based on the distance measurement. Kolodyazne is about 10 kilometers away from the nearest front section, but also 10 kilometers away from the Russian border up there. And that's one reason why the Ukrainians had thought up until now that they would be relatively safe in Kolodyazne and could potentially open or maintain a vehicle depot there without facing too much risk. From where missions are conducted within the region, we now see, however, that this hope was unfortunately misplaced, or yes, it was merely apparent hope that the Ukrainian army had there, because we see current videos of the Russian army where Kolodyazne is now being attacked with fiber optic drones, and not just anything in Kolodyazne, but specifically the vehicle depot. Very difficult footage, I believe. On one side, we see an open door leading to a hall where the Russians had apparently noticed beforehand, with the help of their surveillance drones, that vehicles had driven inside. For some unknown reason, no one made an effort to close the door or even the gate to this hall, and we now see how the Russian drone enters inside and discovers quite a significant and noteworthy find, you could say, namely 2 modified M113S personnel carrier of type YPA-765. From the Netherlands, they also have a more modern turret on it with an automatic cannon. And we can see here how the Russian fiber optic drones are of extremely good quality, attacking the YPA-765, and then over time, managing to set them on fire. And as I mentioned earlier, this takes on an entirely new dimension because we are situated just 10 kilometers away from the border and the front line. The Ukrainians believed they were in a safe place here. However, they truly are not at all. The Russians are now capable with their latest high-tech drones. We see the second one also with the combat train, and back there, another armored vehicle, are highly proficient in flying with precision through open doors, open gates, and open windows before proceeding to execute direct attacks on the vehicles. Now, we unfortunately see here for Ukraine the result of the attack. We now see that the warehouse is in flames where the vehicles were just a moment ago. Crazily enough, they fly in again with another kamikaze drone with fiber optics just to make sure they've caused destruction, and then inflict even more damage with what's likely an RPG-7 warhead, which is attached here to be set up on the drone here. And now we also see how the drone flies in and how it will soon spot one of the armored vehicles here. That means it's fairly safe to say, I think you can see it well here now. Here you can see the automatic cannon on the left side again. Here is the combat turret, and here is the entire vehicle. So we can see quite well that the Russians have indeed achieved their goal here, even though it is, of course, a propaganda video. Despite these circumstances, they managed to effectively show and clearly explain that they successfully placed at least 2 and likely 3 or 4 of them within Kharkiv, roughly 10 kilometers from the front. Can cause harm with fiber optic guided kamikaze drones here. We stay briefly in Kharkiv and move from Kupiansk to the city of Vovchansk, and in Vovchansk we remember the Russian army began an offensive last May. Vovchansk, at that time a thriving city with 18,000 residents where most people still lived. The Russian army's surprise offensive killed or displaced most people here, and now we look at the city 9 months later and see that there's actually almost nothing left of it. These are recordings from the Ukrainian army showing us what the Russians have done in Vovchansk, what they have turned this once thriving city into. And we actually see that every single building has not only been hit and lost its roof, but most of these buildings simply no longer exist anymore. Down here, for example, the church stands out a bit. However, all the large residential areas, meaning these big housing blocks that we've also seen, they had between 8 and 11 floors. These entire buildings were completely destroyed because Ukraine also said we are not surrendering here, we are not retreating, we won't let the Russians take over, but we must definitely defend Vovchansk. Here we can see the center of the city. This was once considered to be the center of the city. These used to be 8 to 11-story residential buildings, which now simply appear as nothing more than ruins. So Ukraine said, we're not retreating here, we need to defend Kharkiv, and to do that, we need to defend Vovchansk. And the Russians resort to what they typically do when they're incapable of expelling the Ukrainians with a flank maneuver or any other method. They destroy every single building, and of course the Ukrainian artillery has also played its part because they are defending themselves, and if the Russians keep advancing, then also target the respective buildings. All in all, however, a really horrendous build of Vovchansk emerges here. And that is, of course, yet another city that unfortunately can probably never be inhabited or lived in again. To conclude, we want to further revisit air defense. Both Russian air defense systems being targeted by Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian air defense within the country itself. We see at the beginning footage of a Strela 10 air defense system of the Russians, which once again ventured too close to the front. It doesn't have a long range, it can shoot a maximum of about 10 to 12 kilometers. And that is nowadays well within the striking range of Ukrainian kamikaze drones. One of these systems has now been spotted here. We'll see it in better quality shortly, even though it's hiding under the trees here. It was subsequently attacked by Ukrainian small quadcopters, which specifically targeted and focused on the Strela 10 missile system, known for its effectiveness and equipped with short-range anti-aircraft missiles that are actually supposed to be shot down. We now see the first impact in the system here, but then we'll also see it again in the replay or in another video, that even the missile launching system located at the upper part is visible. Indeed, yes, we can see it here already, and I believe that perhaps we could pause it at just the right moment if we're able to properly extend it, though I must admit that it's really quite difficult to see. Right, here we see it. So, this is one of the rockets that is actually ready to be launched, but unfortunately it didn't work. These drones are simply too small and are now effectively overwhelming this Strela 10 air defense system of the Russian army, which in Ukraine's east is clearly also intended for long range to prevent possible drone attacks on Russia. And finally, we want to view a video that demonstrates a Ukrainian air defense attempt, or actually a more successful one, namely once again a helicopter of the Mi-8 type, which you can visibly see flying right alongside a Geran 2 drone. Here we see them, those Russian large kamikaze drones with their approximately 800-kilometer range being fired almost across the entire Ukraine. The downside is a max speed of 200 kilometers per hour, some say 150 kilometers per hour, making it easy to track on radar due to its size. And then also very well tracked by Ukrainian Mi-8 helicopters, or Mi-17 in the case of an export variant delivered from the west. Now we can clearly see how the machine gun successfully hit this Geran 2 drone. Hit and crashes, exploding dramatically on a field without causing any damage except to the field itself, effectively saving another critical piece of Ukrainian infrastructure thanks to the skilled deployment of the Mi-8 or Mi-17, who flew alongside. This approach is a strategy that Ukraine is leveraging more and more in order to effectively defend itself against these drone attacks. You just have to spot them in time on the radar, and then you have about or more than 2 hours notice, of course, depending on the target, more than 2 hours to climb, fly to the location, track this Geran 2 drone, and for instance, shoot it down effectively with a helicopter from the respective air force.